when it comes to things like marriage, which, again, we're the we're the group that advocates in society for marriage, right? We're pro-marriage, et cetera. And not just pro-marriage, but we're pro the quote unquote biblical view of marriage. And so my objective was to say, okay, well, what does the Bible actually say about marriage?
Welcome to another episode of Sex Plus Christian Parents Podcast. I'm Jason, Executive Director for Project 619.
And I'm Thomas Anderson Jr., lead pastor of Shallow Hills Fellowship in Spokane, Washington. And today we're talking about marriage. That's right, we're talking about what marriage is. We're also going to engage in conversation about some things that it isn't.
Oh man, this is a needed conversation. I think that so often what we do is we create an idol out of marriage, and discussing this, especially as parents, as we're preparing to talk about marriage with our children, can be so important.
That's exactly right. Even now with my children, I'm noticing they're already forming views on what they think marriage is as they watch my wife and I. And so having this conversation, talking about it, like you said, Jason, destroying the idol of it is what we need to be addressing.
And especially as Christians. And that's why I'm so excited that this episode, we are going to be joined by author, he's a professor, Dr. Kutter Callaway. He is a writer of many books, including Breaking the Marriage Idol, which we'll be discussing some today, so pay attention. It's in this book that Kutter actually discusses where the church is, how it's developed a theology around marriage, and at times even idolize the institution of marriage.
Because as you said, usually when we say that, we mean a very, very narrow and specific thing that I'm like, that just doesn't, I don't see that in the Bible. What I do see are all sorts of different marriages. And often when we talk about what the Bible says about marriage, we conveniently ignore a whole bunch of texts because they don't fit with our agenda. And then we also elevate or focus on texts that, in my mind, aren't actually about marriage. They're about something else. They're important. They might inform the way we think about marriage, but in their own right, they're not simply about that. And so the few pieces that I kind of pick out are, one, a sort of description, like here's where the Bible describes the various marriages, especially in the Old Testament. And if we look at the patriarchs in particular, those who were held up as, ambassadors, champions, paragons of the faith, they had all sorts of complicated marriages. And what's interesting is the Bible doesn't, at least the biblical authors don't condemn or critique the marriages. They're complicated. The results of those are problematic often, but the patriarchs taking up multiple wives for various different reasons, on the surface of it, is not critiqued or condemned by the biblical authors. I just kind of walk through and go, look at all these different kinds of marriages, and before we too quickly say, here's what marriage means in the Bible, let's acknowledge that those marriages exist. Okay, that doesn't mean, though, that I think Christians should be polygamists. So I want to make that very clear. What it does mean is the Bible has a lot of marriages, and it doesn't come out and say, here's what it means. Then there's other texts, for example, in Genesis, and we have a lot of people that talk about marriage almost exclusively in terms of Adam and Eve, and what goes on in the early parts of Genesis. And my read of that section really is to say that we're bringing to the text these assumptions about being, quote unquote, man and wife that aren't there. And some of this has to do with some interpretive moves. And I'm not going to die on this hill, but it does seem to me that in the early goings of Genesis, what the authors are getting at is, what does it mean to be human?
I absolutely love this. And I have to admit, as a leader of a nonprofit that talks on sexual integrity, talks often about marriage, I can sometimes be responsible and have actually done the very thing that he is talking against, which is making it more about marriage than it is about being human. It's so different from the conversations we have around marriage. And that's why I love this. I think this impacts the way we talk about marriage in our homes as parents.
And the human, according to the authors of Genesis, the Adam is not Adam, it's the human, and the human is both Ish and Isha, male and female, and so there is this a really important distinction within what it means to be human. That means we are sexual beings. That means we are differentiated beings. That means we are communal and are designed for relationality, intimate relationality. Those are all very important things to me. What that doesn't mean is that's what marriage is. And in early Genesis, the author stops and goes, and for this reason, this is why a woman will leave her family, and I don't have it in front of me, so I might be misquoting it now. Does the woman leave or does the man leave?
Kutter is referring to Genesis 2:24, which states, "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh."
See, it's even individuals that study scripture that don't always get it right. This is why we love having guests like this that actually say, okay, I might actually be wrong and we can fix it here. But I do appreciate Cutter's honesty. And it's also important for us then to realize as parents, we don't always have to have it right there memorized. We can actually go to the very scripture and actually create an opportunity to be able to engage this with our kids.
Whichever it says is actually the reverse of what the culture of the day would do. And so part of what's interesting, I think, is that then Jesus goes and riffs on this same passage of the sort of leaving and cleaving part of Adam and Eve's relationship. And he is talking, and so this is another reason why people will say this is all about marriage. Jesus is replying to some Pharisees in a question about divorce. And so what I find interesting is Jesus is asked a question about divorce and what does God think about it, basically. And he goes to Genesis and goes, look, this is why divorce is so traumatic. This is why God hates divorce. It's because what you're doing is you're undoing the very fabric of what it means to be a human being. What he's not commenting on, in my mind, is what it means and what it means to ultimately be human is to be married. That's not what he's getting at. What he's getting at is, here's why it's such a tragedy for marriages to end in divorce, because you're running against what it means to be human. Here's what it means to be human, Jesus will say, right? And so you look at those parts of Genesis, and for me, it was to say, this really isn't about marriage, it's about what it means to be human. Then you look at the patriarchs and you go, these descriptions aren't necessarily advocating for these forms of marriage, but what they do is they underscore that I think none of us are, quote unquote, called to be married generically. But you get in all these stories of the patriarchs very specific calls to specific people under specific conditions that God urges his people to undergo for the sake of participating in what God's project is. And so often the patriarchs are having to have children because you have, Abraham, and the lineage is important. And you see this time and again that when God does call us and prompt us to become married to specific people, it's for a participating in God's project in the world, not so that we can realize and fulfill some generic calling as if God says, you are to be married. It's no, this time, this person, this place, and this way.
Okay, there's a lot here. So there's a lot to unpack. We'll do more unpacking here in a moment, but I hope you understand what Kutter is sharing. Marriage, it's not the end goal. Rather, it's about marriage being a part of how God can show himself to the world. I mean, Thomas, has this been something that you've always engaged, or is this new for you? I mean, what has this been like for you as a pastor?
Yeah, as a pastor, I'm even making that shift where marriage is not the mission here. We see this when people preach from the pulpit or we teach in small groups, that a number of individuals seem to almost shame singles or at least hold in high esteem marriage. And so we're trying to even reframe our own thinking as we talk about the text and what's happening here. I wonder, for our listeners, what's your gut reaction to that kind of statement? Do you agree or not with that? I want you to keep listening here.
So this was the kind of fun part for me. One of the most fun elements of writing the book was basically I got to this point where I said, so there's the Old Testament stuff. Then there's, the New Testament. Again, Jesus starts talking about that we won't be married in the age to come. And Jesus wasn't married. Okay. So my thought was, if marriage isn't about like fulfilling our romantic desires like the Disney princess movies tell us that should be, Well, then what is a Christian marriage about? Like what is it that we should be advocating for when we go, I do feel called to marry this person for this reason? What would be the reasons we might go, yeah, I could reasonably say God is calling me to do that.
This is why I love this book. Cutter does a really good job of highlighting what he believes should be present if one feels that he or she is called specifically to marriage. He begins with justice.
I think a Christian marriage, if two people are considering whether or not they should be married, should have something in play as it regards justice, enacting justice in the world, and that could look like a number of things. I know quite a few people who get married in part because that allows them, both in terms of practical resources, but then just emotional, psychological, to care for example, orphans. We have tons of orphans in the world, globally and then locally, that need families. They need parents. They need people that can actually provide for their material needs. And I think and it doesn't mean that every Christian couple that would get married needs to think that they're going to adopt. But in terms of expanding the family of God in that way, I think that's an inspiring, hopeful, optimistic way of thinking about marriage. C.S. Lewis gets married in part to meet the material needs of a woman and her children. And he went against, the church leadership of his day, and got married anyway, in part because he wanted to care for widows and orphans, right? I mean, like the marriage that he entered into is one that both. And the danger of this is it could sound like, you as a male are going out and like rescuing women and marrying them to like save them. That's not the case. Both of them were married to basically provide for her children so that they wouldn't have to go back to the United States and be with an abusive father. And so situations like that, I go, this is a completely radically different way of thinking about Christian marriage, of what if, we could envision a reality where our principal urge, or the driving force as to why we were getting married, had little to do or nothing to do with our romantic fulfillment, our soulmate thing, and instead was a commitment to respond to God's command to justice, to enact justice as Christians.
Okay, so according to Kutter, another reason Christians should get married, and catch this, is having a shared desire to serve through hospitality.
And that's just absolutely crazy to me, because imagine the mind shift that would have to occur for us to think this way. It's just not in our lexicon. It's not the way we've ever been taught to think. I mean, what would it look like to speak this to our kids? What would it look like for you as a father to speak this to your kids?
It's a completely different way to model our marriage. I mean, I wasn't demonstrated that by my parents or didn't see that in other marriages because, as you said, Jason, it's a complete shift in the way we think about it.
It is. And I love that he hits upon this hospitality.
Some of the others is, for example, hospitality, I think, is another a key piece. This too is rooted in a sense of Christian hospitality that might strike some as odd, but hospitality comes from this word, the Latin word, the same word we get host or hostel or hospital, hospice care, but it's also where we get the word hostile and hostage, right? So to be hospitable, I think in the deep sense that Christ calls us to, means opening up the most intimate of our spaces, even to those who might do us harm, especially to those who might do us harm.
Okay, this is still such a powerful point for me. I mean, the idea of inviting someone into your home that may disrupt or even be hostile just absolutely sounds absurd. I mean, it's certainly different from what I've heard outside of the church. It's not even something I hear often in the church. But the crazy thing is as I have actually seen research. Barna did research around what inspires growth among children in the home. And one of the things they stated was seeing their home be a place that is hospitable to others. I mean, that's just absolutely mind-blowing.
You know, Jason, the pastors here at Shiloh several months ago started diving into the scriptures around this term hospitality. And while we weren't talking about marriage specifically, and that's challenging to me now to rethink and reframe my mind, we did recognize that it seems to be describing this healing relationship taking place. So this just fits right in that, right? Where you're bringing people inside your home who may be disruptive or hostile and providing a healing space for them. But the beautiful thing is, this hospitable characteristic we're to take on as believers isn't just towards those outside your marriage, it's also inward facing towards our spouse. And that is mind blowing to me.
It's easy. Jesus says this, right? It's easy to love people who love you. It's easy to invite people into your home who you know are going to bring good food and beverages and going to, bring flowers, and their kids are always going to be nice or whatever. It's much more difficult to invite people into your space that you know are going to disrupt you and are going to unsettle you and are going to present problems to you. And that, to me, one, just getting married and inviting, literally cohabitating with a new person. You talk to newlyweds, their first year often is a struggle because of that very thing, right? Like, you're in my space, you're getting in my way, right? But a Christian notion of hospitality, it works basically against that. It's not about saying finding the person that fits most easily within your space. It's actually saying, how can I as an individual be hospitable to this other? And then now as a couple, right, as a unit, how do we imagine our relationship intentionally being one in which we open our space up to those who might actually disrupt our lives? And that's where sort of the bigger vision of the book and elsewhere goes, to say part of what this is us reconceiving of what the family of God is on a fundamental level. What does it mean to be a married couple who opens your space up to people who are single, to people who don't have families, to people, whatever it is, and vice versa? What does it mean to be single and to open your most intimate of spaces to people who are in different relationships? And what would that look like as a community of faith if we allowed that to happen?
It's so appropriate for him to mention singleness right here. He's essentially saying this is not just something we practice when we're married. It's because we're human. I mean, this is what makes this whole thing stand out from any other conversation around marriage we've probably had. I mean, imagine if these traits were taught not as a way to be married, but a way to be human, because they're so ingrained that when our kids marry, these are the very traits that become a part of their marriage. It means they're remaining human. They're simply living out what it means to be human.
So now Cutter is going to shift and talk about the obvious need for love as a factor when getting married. I always look at love not as a feeling, but as an action. And Cutter's going to pick up on that. He's not talking about the romantic sense. Love utterly is submitting yourself and putting your spouse's needs in front of your own. You have to check this out.
Some of our conceptions of what it means to love and to lead are skewed along these sort of entrenched kind of power dynamics. For me, the model of love that Jesus gives is completely and utterly self-giving, meaning that it's not enough to simply say, oh, I'm egalitarian, let's say, or whatever. It's to say that my commitment to you is one of utter and complete submission, that all of my needs, all of my interests, all of my desires, all of my wants come second to yours. And that's actually what love means. Now, that makes a lot of sense. That's just a very sort of basic Christian thing that, like, yeah, it should be self-giving, it's others-oriented, whatever. But in that deeper sense, that's actually a really hard thing to do when you walk into a relationship with a vision of that relationship as if it was designed to meet your needs and your desires. And to answer the problems that you've got or the longings that you have. This actually is a radical reversal, even though it really is tied directly into our conception of Christian love, right? That isn't necessarily romantic. And so for me, that's a big part of the calling of marriage, and it really is something that I think is the most challenging part, both for me, but then for everybody else, is to say, how do I actually see this as an opportunity to enact self-giving love?
Okay, so we've got a couple of motivations that Kutter reveals as healthy reasons for pursuing marriage. They're justice, hospitality, love. And again, these are probably not things that we've engaged, so taking time to think about them outside of this episode will probably be helpful. Uh, but there is one last thing that he talks about, a final motivation that Kutter highlights, and it's biblical hope. And I'm sure we've had discussions around this in our home or thought about this in church, but the way in which he talks about it, it's especially in the framework of marriage, it really is helpful, and it's a great final tool as we engage in this conversation or prepare for the conversation of marriage in our home.
I think I say this in the book, but on the nature of hope, Miroslav Volf says hope is, or Christian hope is, love stretching itself out into the future. And I've always loved that idea in terms of what we kind of do when we commit to love a spouse in that way. It's a future-oriented thing. It's sort of a declaration that I'm going to commit in this way to you, and it's something that is directed and has a directionality that's important for it to be a Christian version of hope, anyway. And again, this is why I think in our current climate, the Christian community has a really great opportunity to go all in on the value of marriage and of Christian marriage, because it is a very it's a very hopeful thing. Because in truth, if I didn't have Christian hope, this notion of love stretching itself in the future, I would have no other choice but to do the Taylor Swift thing, right? Like, why would I bother committing beyond today to anybody? There is no promise of tomorrow. There is no promise of anything more than our sort of fleeting encounter between two sort of physical bodies. The notion that love might endure, might stretch itself out beyond, is a distinctly Christian vision, I think, that I will go to my grave advocating for.
Something we often say at Project 619 is that marriage is a possibility. It's not a promise. And the way in which Kutter has talked about the biblical concept of marriage, it's just not a generic calling for all Christians. It's instead a specific calling for a specific people to take part in God's work of justice, hospitality, love, and hope in the world. I mean, Thomas, this preaches.
It absolutely does, brother. Listen, God is a God of justice, a God of love, and we get our hope in him. So these are literally characteristics that flow from his very nature, and we see them landing in our reasons and motivations for marriage. It's fantastic.
And I think that we have to understand the way we begin the conversations with our kids around marriage, it has a tremendous influence on other areas. Now, we will get into this in future episodes, but one of the things that we have to understand, and the reason we have this episode first, this idea of what marriage could be, what we see it doing in scripture, is because I think it's going to build towards other conversations we have on future episodes. And this is why I love when Kutter explained what he does with his kids in his own home when he's talking about marriage.
I think, one, I at least try to do a couple things with my kids. One is to be honest with them about what the Bible says, and to be say that here in this space of our family, there are no questions you can't ask. At least the Fuller Youth Institute says that a lot of parents fear questions that they can't handle, right? Like questions that they may not have answers to, or that imply some sort of doubt, right? So you might worry as a parent that if your child sees in the Bible polygamy or these other sort of things that go on, or certain places in the Bible where a woman's rapist is told to marry her, right? I mean, like these really challenging things that you go, wait, what's happening there? And some might fear or think that we need to keep our kids from that and keep them away from that and not expose them. Now, again, every age is different. I mean, there are certain things that certain ages don't need to be exposed to, but by and large, once a child reaches the age that they can be encountering these things, The challenge or the goal is to say any and all questions are allowed here. We're going to process them. We're going to walk through them, even if that's to say, I don't totally understand or know why that is the case, right? I mean, that's fine. What the Fuller Youth Institute says is that these questions are not what are toxic to faith. What's toxic to faith, and the reason that especially teenagers who are involved in churches leave the faith after they get out of the home, what's toxic is silence. What's toxic to faith around matters of sexuality or whatever is to create a context in which they can't even broach the question, right? And so I think the Bible raises all sorts of challenging questions about marriage and sexuality. But my goal, my job, I think, as a parent is to continually lay the groundwork to say, here in this space, all questions are on the table. You can ask anything and we're going to process them. And we're not afraid of them. They're not going to, somehow, the idea is not going to somehow poison us or, something like that.
Okay, so now Kutter is going to bring up something that we've actually discussed a little bit before on this podcast. He's going to talk about the importance of preparing a safe space for discussing things found in the Bible with thoughtful media discernment. We invite you to check out episode 9 of this podcast where we've discussed already media discernment, but listen to Kutter as he gives you a bit more information.
The other side too is sort of twofold. So that's just the Bible side. The other side to me is to make sure that I help them interpret the stories of their surrounding culture, so that when we watch Frozen, I'm helping them process that and helping them be competent interpreters of stories, because those are powerful. And that, again, I'm a media guy, so that's sort of, I skew that way, but really being a wise guide for them as they process that. And then that's sort of external stories, but the internal stories as a member of a church and as a leader of the church, to ensure that I don't reinscribe those same narratives in our church. I remember the day when, I currently attend a Nazarene church. I'm not Nazarene myself, but we've been there for the last decade almost. And Nazarenes are fully open and endorsing to women being in full ministry, but it happens that we very rarely have women preaching or up front. And so it's almost this implicit exclusion of women. And I remember the first time a woman stood up and preached at our church. At the time, I think she was 8, my oldest, came home and got her some standout and all afternoon long was preaching and was like super excited about being, and I was like realizing, oh, how powerful these symbols are for our children, and saying, here's who is allowed to do this or this. And if every person that gets up is married, and if every sermon we preach about has an application to married life or family life, if everything we do exiles the single people from the ministries that are real or important, that communicates very loudly to them what it means to be single, what it means to be married, whether or not this community is going to support their calling in the future as a married or single person. And so for me, that's another really important space where I go, I need to take care to say, is my church, my local community, endorsing and providing a vision of life to my children that will say, hey, no matter what God calls you to, what we're about is supporting you living a flourishing life of faithfulness in response to God's call. And if that's as a single person, then we're all in. If that's as a married person, we're all in. And I want them to be able to see that and feel that in the way they worship.
Wow, Jason, this is good, true, and heavy of a word, because ultimately Kutter is saying it is important to acknowledge what our church is communicating explicitly and implicitly, and how that impacts our children. We have to be sharp. We have to be alert to really recognize what's coming from leadership, what's coming from the pulpit. And as a pastor, that even challenges me again to go, what are we communicating? What are we saying at every level of our organization that can give life to those who listen, especially our young ones who we're raising up?
I absolutely love what you're saying. And I have to be aware of that too with a ministry that's dedicated to talking about this is how are we engaging this? What are we saying? What are we doing? And being careful to not exclude or to imply something that we don't intend to. So yeah, I 100% agree with what you're sharing. I think it's so important. And that's why we asked Kutter to give some closing thoughts on just how we're communicating this to our children.
I think what I would say is what it means to be married is essentially that God asks some of us to enter into relationships for the sake of loving mercy, walking humbly, and pursuing justice. Right? That sometimes that call requires us to partner up in specific ways, and one of those ways is to be married. And it's related to I think the question when sometimes they'll ask about like, what is, when I say I love mommy, why do you love her, or what does that mean? And I'll often say, well, because I choose to love her. This is a choice. It's a commitment. It's a thing that I choose to do. And I have to choose it every day. It's not something that happens to me or whatever. It's an active choice that I make to commit to this person.
We're so grateful that you're continuing to engage, listen, and respond. We're hearing from you, and we're grateful that you have taken the time to download and listen to this podcast.
Jason, I am thrilled to be on this journey with you, and for our listeners, while I know some of the content is reshaping and reformatting your mind, I want to just say great job of continuing to do the good work of pushing towards learning about all the topics we discuss.
Absolutely. And I just also want to say one last thing before we close out this episode. If you have not already logged on to project619.org or gone to theverygoodsextalk.org and checked out our e-course, please do so. It is a great resource. We dive into many of the conversations that you hear on these episodes, and we have made this free until August 31st. So go check it out, theverygoodsextalk.org. It's not going to lead you somewhere you don't want to go. It's going to be a resource that you can use. Hey, thank you so much for listening to this episode. I'm Jason.
And I'm Thomas.
Until next time, we'll see you then. This podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people at Project 619. This episode was edited, produced, and sound designed by our very own Corey Crawford.